Buonasera e benvenuti a PDA Social Club. Questa sera l'intervista la facciamo direttamente in presenza perché Viet Thanh Nguyen, l'autore di Io sono l'uomo con due facce, testé edito da Neri Pozza, è in Italia per presentare il suo libro in diverse occasioni tra festival e librerie. Viet Thanh Nguyen è uno scrittore vietnamita, nato in Vietnam, ma trasferitosi all'età di 4 anni negli Stati Uniti, e quindi uno scrittore pienamente americano e uno scrittore pienamente vietnamita. L'abbiamo conosciuto grazie a 2 strepitosi romanzi, funambolici romanzi come Il simpatizzante, che ha vinto il Premio Pulitzer nel 2016, e Il militante, un unico protagonista, una spia, un ufficiale dell'esercito nordvietnamita infiltrato nell'esercito del sud, che alla caduta di Saigon viene comandato di seguire i fuggiaschi del regime appena crollato nel loro esilio americano per tenerli sotto controllo e riferire ad Hanoi. Lui non avrebbe nessuna voglia, ma obbedisce da bravo soldato e si ritrova uomo con 2 facce, infiltrato appunto tra gli esuli vietnamiti in California, a seguirne le vicende e a riferire le loro trame, sempre che ce ne siano. Nel secondo libro addirittura verrà spedito come boat people in Francia, sempre per svolgere la sua attività di spione. E come tutti i buoni spioni, per essere credibile, deve partecipare profondamente alla vita di quelli che spia. E allora Io sono l'uomo con 2 facce, è un libro diverso dai 2 romanzi di cui stiamo parlando, perché è un saggio, è un pamphlet, è un'autobiografia, è un romanzo familiare, è un libro estremamente composito, ricco di linee di riflessione e di linee narrative nello stesso tempo, ma che è anche la perfetta introduzione, il perfetto dietro le quinte dei 2 romanzi che avevamo già imparato a conoscere e ad amare. E quindi Viet Thanh Nguyen, nato in Vietnam e ripartorito in America, come scrive in questo suo ultimo libro, com'è che è diventato un ingrato, così lei si definisce? Com'è successo che un rifugiato, figlio di rifugiati, in fuga dal comunismo, si sia radicalizzato diventando in America e gli Stati Uniti addirittura marxista?
My parents are very devout Catholics and very devout capitalists. And so they raised me in this environment of believing in capitalism and Catholicism. And ironically, I became a Marxist atheist. And I think that what happened was that I took too seriously the lessons of Catholicism. For me, reading the Bible and undergoing a Catholic education from when I was very young until I was 17 impressed upon me the wrong lessons, which were the lessons about Jesus Christ as being a radical revolutionary who believed in social justice and equality and who was against hypocritical, domineering institutions of power. This is not the official lessons that were being transmitted through the Catholic Church itself. This was the lessons that I was getting from my own education. So I was being given an excellent canonical education, which turned me into a very good reader. And if you're a very good reader, it's very hard to simply accept the official lessons that are being given to you. So even though my parents were raising me to be very conservative, I took the wrong lessons because I was absorbing the radical lessons of the Catholic experience. And I really think that's what's turned me into someone who is committed to social justice and radical equality, both as political practice, but also as something that I can try to achieve through writing.
Cos'è una minoranza modello e quanto ha pesato appartenere a una minoranza modello la sua trasformazione appunto in un ingrato?
In the United States, perhaps in Italy too, minorities, however you define them, are typically looked at by the majority in an either-or fashion, good or bad. And Asian immigrants to the United States and also to France, another country I'm familiar with, have historically been situated negatively as the yellow peril, the threat from Asia. We are a threat economically, politically, hygienically, and so on. However, in recent decades, Asian immigrants and Asian Americans in the United States have become the model minority. And by that I mean that now we are seen as good students, good neighbors, good workers. We're quiet, we're docile, we're friendly, and we serve as a model to the other minorities, typically Black and Latino and indigenous peoples, who are not very good minorities in the dominant perception. So we are given an invitation to enter into American society at the expense of other minorities in the United States. I think that's how it also works. This process also works in France as well, from what I have seen, where the Vietnamese are a very model minority in France, partly because we do seem to want to be included and to work hard, but also because we are not Arab or Black or North African or Muslim and so on. And so I think my work has been very much to reject this kind of binary of good and bad, and to reject the terms of gratitude that we should be grateful to be included in the United States. Of course, I am grateful for all the opportunities that I have as an American, as a refugee who has been welcomed to the United States, but part of me can never stop thinking that maybe I wouldn't have needed to be rescued by the United States if we hadn't been invaded by the United States in the first place. And model minorities are not supposed to bring up that question.
Tutto il libro, in questo davvero risulta un parallelo perfetto dei due romanzi, è all'insegna della contraddittorietà, della duplicità, della molteplicità. Viet Thanh Nguyen, lei non è una spia come il suo protagonista, ma anche lei rivendica o lamenta due e più facce, americano e vietnamita, colonizzato e colonizzatore, impregnato di cultura americana e nello stesso tempo irrimediabilmente altro.
The opening line of The Sympathizer is, I'm a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces. And that certainly characterizes my spy in that novel. But it's also an expression of myself autobiographically, how I felt my own experience as a refugee growing up as an American. I'm writing The Sympathizer as a trilogy. And in the third novel, which I'm about to write, actually the opening line is, I'm a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of many faces. And this has actually been an important transformation for the character of the spy, but also for myself, because the idea of being caught between two sides, the colonizer and the colonized, for example, is a very powerful one. That kind of binary certainly helped me to think through the problem of opposites and contradictions. But I always thought of The Sympathizer as a dialectical novel, and in order for that project to be realized, it had to become a dialectical trilogy. But in the process of the dialectic, you have to go beyond the binary. You have to go beyond two faces, two sides. And so it's been very important to recognize in myself that I'm more than just a duality, that the duality is a starting point for understanding how power has operated in society, but also through me. And in order to work through the problems of power and domination, I have to go beyond duality and embrace the many faces that have always been inside of myself.
La linea portante del libro è chiaramente la vicenda di famiglia, quindi il passaggio dal Vietnam in fuga all'insediamento negli Stati Uniti e via dicendo. Di pagina in pagina, quelle che vanno crescendo e man mano a occupare sempre più spazio sono infatti le figure di Ba e Ma, del padre e della madre, e specie della madre che davvero si staglia come figura centrale di tutto Io sono l'uomo con due facce. Viene da dire che il Viet narratore riscopre crescendo queste figure genitoriali, prende consapevolezza della loro forza e della loro grandezza. E com'è che è successo?
I think my relationship to my parents is obviously very important to me, but also very banal. Because I think that the problems that I wrestle with in this book, who are my parents? What do they mean to me? What do I remember of them? These are universal questions that I think probably many or all of us grapple with eventually at some point. And I think that I had to grapple with them much more than I ever thought I would. Number one, after my mother passed away in 2018, and I had to confront the mortality of my parents. But number two, after I myself became a parent and realized that my own children will be looking at me in the same way that I looked at my parents, or the way that I ignored my parents. And so, obviously, my mother and father shaped me greatly in ways that have been contradictory. I do feel that when I was growing up, I was tormented by my parents, that they were so strict, so Catholic, so conservative. They wouldn't let me do anything I wanted to do. They wanted to turn me into a person that I didn't want to become. And yet they also left me with a sense of discipline and sacrifice and love and compassion that has shaped me tremendously. Despite my own best efforts, I think I became a good person because of what my parents did to me. And I became a good person in the sense that I know that I seem to be a good father to my children and a good partner to my wife. And I think that those values that they imparted to me, have shaped me as a writer as well, as I've tried to use my writing to both honor my parents and to investigate the history that produced them and shaped them as the individuals who then affected me. So it's a very complicated story to investigate because they gave me, intentionally and unintentionally, the tools to be a writer, the discipline, the passion, the sacrifice, the empathy, and then I've used those tools to honor them and also to betray them because I don't think they ever wanted me to write about them. And yet here I am, having written a memoir about the two people who were the most important people in my life, an act of both honesty and treachery all at the same time.
Lei è fuggito dal Vietnam all'età di 4 anni, molto presto forse per avere dei veri ricordi della vita in Vietnam. E allora qual è il suo rapporto con il Vietnam? Sappiamo che è tornato nel suo paese d'origine, ma cosa vuol dire tornare in un posto in cui fondamentalmente non si è mai stati?
I think that Vietnam has always occupied a place in my mind because I was born there, and I know I was born there, and I always felt a psychic and cultural connection to Vietnam. And that was maintained because the United States is home to the largest Vietnamese community outside of Vietnam, and we are here in the United States because of the war. And so being Vietnamese was always important to me, even if it was oftentimes a conflicted relationship, both to being Vietnamese but also to Vietnam itself. And that conflict was partly due to the cultural issues of growing up as a Vietnamese in the United States, but also the political issue. What does Vietnam mean in the global imagination, and what does it mean in the American imagination? And of course, for most of the world, Vietnam exists as this fantasy space of revolution against colonialism from the French to the Americans, which I think is true. But it's also very problematic to have that fantasy in the United States, which is a deeply anti-communist country, and to grow up in a Vietnamese refugee community, which is also very deeply anti-communist as well. So my grappling with Vietnam is not only a cultural issue of who am I as an individual, but it's also a political issue. What does the Vietnamese revolutionary inheritance mean to me? So I did have to go to Vietnam many times to investigate these questions for myself and to grapple with the fact that Vietnam is still the place where most of my relatives still live. And it's a place where communism is still officially the politics of the country, and yet a place where capitalism is also the pretty much official economics of the country as well. And so there is so much happening in Vietnam that I think is important for us to understand as we consider questions of revolution, of fantasy, of the relation between capitalism and communism, and how to negotiate these ideologies in a world in which both of them are deeply problematic in their own ways, even as they offer certain kinds of salvations as well. And my relationship to Vietnam was then complicated by becoming a writer, because the kind of writing that I do is deeply personal, but also deeply political. Political in the sense that I believe in certain kinds of ideologies, including communism, but I also believe as a writer that one should never be fully committed to an ideology. One should always be committed to the truth. And ideologies and truths don't always reconcile. So every ideology that I've ever experienced has always failed in some way or another, which is not to dismiss them, but writers have to grapple with that complexity. And so that's what returning to Vietnam has meant for me. after The Sympathizer became a success in 2016, what was interesting was to see that the Vietnamese government did not want to publish or publicize my works in Vietnam, most of them. And so it's become impossible for me for now to return to Vietnam, to a country that won't publish or discuss my works, which has left me in an interesting situation because I certainly would like to return. My own children know they're Vietnamese. They want to see Vietnam, but I haven't resolved for myself whether it's possible to go to a country that rejects the things that I've written about them.
Di Io sono l'uomo con due facce colpisce da subito, anche proprio visivamente, in termini di impaginazione, la complessità strutturale, la natura molteplice sul piano dello stile e dei contenuti. Dicevamo autobiografia, saggio critico, pamphlet, tutti questi aspetti convivono e trovano ognuno una propria specifica voce che si armonizza però con tutte le altre, fino ad arrivare a spezzare la riga in versi, fino a diventare poema. Come è nata e come è andato componendosi questa complessità di scrittura?
You asked earlier about two faces, and I said I have many faces, and I think the book expresses that. I think with each book that I write, I have to find the style that's suitable for the project of the book. So each of my books looks different than the other. And so with this particular project, I had to grapple with the fact that I was writing about my family, my parents, and myself, and doing so through the problem that I have an imperfect memory. I remember certain things from my life and my family's lives, and there are others that have been erased deliberately or unintentionally. And so my own relationship to my memory is very fluid, oftentimes very fragmentary. And so if I were to write a book, a memoir, that looks like The Sympathizer, for example, where everything is very fluid and everything is very cohesive, that would actually be very fictional. And I don't know how many of us, in relationship to our own memories, have a cohesive narrative about ourselves. My own experience of my memories is very fragmentary, and it comes in bits and pieces, and there's no chronology to it. And so I had to adopt some of that for the book in order to make the book in its shape, in the way that it's written, in the way that it looks, authentic to the way that I've experienced my memory and myself.
Quanto è importante lo humor nella sua scrittura? L'elemento satirico è fortissimo nel simpatizzante e nel militante, ma è molto presente anche in questo libro.
I grew up raised very Catholic, which meant that I was very repressed. And in order to be a writer, repression is good, but one also has to find one's own voice, which means digging deep into oneself. And so the deeper I dug into myself and to try to find my voice, my authentic self, I discovered, ironically, that I had a sense of humor. No one knew that I had a sense of humor before I became a writer. I didn't know I had a sense of humor before I became a writer. But I think a sense of humor is actually very, very relevant to anybody who wants to critique power, because the powerful do not want to be laughed at. The powerful cloak their hypocrisies and their contradictions and the absurdities of betraying their ideals, and to laugh at them is to reveal what it is that they want to hide. So laughter for me has been both a survival mechanism, but also a mechanism to enact the kind of political critique that I want to carry out in my novels, but also in this new nonfiction book. Satire has always been a tool of the weak against the powerful. It's a tool that requires no training. It requires no weapons except the imagination and the wit of the writer and of the people. Right? That the people, the people who are excluded from power, have always used mockery as a way to defend themselves and to make their lives more livable as they look at those above them who are more powerful. And in terms of writing and of literature from the reader's perspective, I think humor also becomes important as a way to alleviate the pressure of the seriousness of the writing. If you go back even, for example, Shakespeare, the tragedies always have comedy mixed into them as well. So that balance of the tragic comic is present in many kinds of literature, but it's been very important to me to use the tragedy and the comedy simultaneously, to acknowledge both the seriousness of the subjects that I grapple with, but also the necessity to laugh, to survive as a reader, but also as a writer.
La doppiezza di cui continuiamo a parlare si fa evidente nel confronto con la cultura americana, un grande amore, un'autentica passione per scrittori e registi, libri e film, ma nello stesso tempo la denuncia di una profonda ipocrisia e di un razzismo inestirpabile anche laddove ci siano le migliori intenzioni, a partire da capolavori come, un esempio per tutti, Apocalypse Now, il capolavoro di Francis Ford Coppola.
It's interesting being American, which I am, but also being someone who's not American, as a refugee and as an outsider, as an Asian, because on the one hand, I participate wholeheartedly in American culture, and not just American culture, but Western culture as well. I mean, I grew up basically in the library, the public library, reading the great works of Western literature and the not so great works as well. And those works were not addressed to me. I don't think anybody who was writing these books who was English or American or German or French or Italian or Spanish thought that one day a Vietnamese refugee boy would be reading their works. And yet their works still spoke to me. And that's the way it should be. So that when I grapple with these great and not so great works of the Western canon, whether it's literature or movies, I recognize my place in relationship to these works, which is that I am the non-ideal spectator or reader. And it's not just Apocalypse Now, but there's many other works in which I have both seen myself as a human being, but also have seen myself degraded as someone who is Asian. So Apocalypse Now was not unique. It was just very personal because it was about the Vietnam War, and it was about the American perspective on the Vietnam War. And what's interesting about Apocalypse Now is that its heart is in the right place, I think, because it is ostensibly an anti-war movie, and it recognizes the atrocities that Americans have committed, and yet at the same time, it's incapable of recognizing the actual humanity of Vietnamese people. And encountering that work obviously traumatized me, enraged me, but also excited me, because I think it is technically a masterpiece, and I think it speaks to so many human truths, including the human truth of racism. That one can be a great artist and be a racist or a sexist, a classist, all at the same time. And so that to me just speaks to the complexity and the power of even the greatest works of art. And I recognize that for me as a writer, to be as good of a writer as I can be, I have to recognize that complexity. I have to recognize that Apocalypse Now and everything that it symbolizes has helped to motivate me as a writer, that I want to write back against Apocalypse Now and everything that it represents, not because it's a failure, but because it is a flawed masterpiece. And so I'm grateful for everything that Apocalypse Now and everything that it represents in terms of Western power and the Western canon, everything that it has done for me. And I recognize that I myself as a writer am a flawed human being. I'm a flawed writer, I'm sure. I produce works that I hope move people, but I also produce works that may have flaws in them that I don't even recognize that is affecting readers in some way. So all that is to say that I situate myself in this tradition of writers who are using their art to their best ability to try to grapple with questions of abuse and power and inhumanity and humanity in such a flawed and contradictory way.
La soluzione alla colonizzazione è la decolonizzazione, dichiara nel suo libro. Ma come si decolonizza una cultura? Come possiamo noi decolonizzarci?
That's a question that I've grappled with for a very long time, because I feel that colonization is obviously a physical process, economic, political, and so on, but it's also a cultural process, it's a psychological process as well. And it's a process that affects the colonizer as well as the colonized. I think that the colonizer has to decolonize themselves. That's very hard for the colonizer to do. it might even be harder for the colonizer to decolonize themselves than for the colonized to do so. Because at least for the colonized, it's in our own interests to decolonize ourselves. From the colonizer's point of view, it's against your interests to decolonize yourselves. I recognize how deeply embedded colonization is inside of me whenever I visit France, for example. France colonized Vietnam for more than 80 years. It was a terrible process. The Vietnamese who rebelled against the French used the word slavery to describe what the French did to them. If you visit France today and you raise the question of Indochina or Vietnam, there is no perception among the French that it was a terrible experience, certainly not slavery. And for a lot of the Vietnamese who have been subjected to colonization, they've forgotten that part of it as well. And so even for a lot of Vietnamese people, we would rather embrace the positive aspects of French colonization. And yes, were there positive aspects of French colonization? Of course. Of course there were positive aspects, but those positive aspects are completely wrapped up in the negative aspects as well. And I recognize whenever I visit France that I have been mentally colonized because even the sound of the French language seduces me. And it shouldn't. Why should the sound of the French language seduce me and not the sound of the Vietnamese language, for example? So there's been so much work that I've had to do to both recognize the depth of psychological and cultural colonization inside of me, and not just from the French, but from the Americans and the rest of European culture, and to attempt to identify how much I've absorbed ideologically about the values of the West and of colonization. That extends to everything from the way that I see myself personally, to how I think about politics, to my reflexive anti-communism, to my reflexive orientation towards the Western canon. These are things that I struggle with constantly, and for me, the way that I try to deal with that is through my own writing and through my own reading. And I think it's a lifelong process for someone who has been colonized to decolonize themselves. And likewise, in terms of decolonization, in the rest of the real world, I think we all have to recognize that colonization was a process that took place over more than 500 years. It's going to probably take at least that long to decolonize the world itself, maybe longer. And so for me to confront the fact that it's going to take me the rest of my life to decolonize myself, and maybe not even successfully do so by my death, that's just me confronting how deeply powerful colonization has shaped the world and me.
Abbiamo solo scalfito la ricchezza di temi, di suggestioni, di linee stilistiche che costituiscono questo straordinario viaggio nell'opera di Viet Thanh Nguyen, autore di Io sono l'uomo con due facce, edito da Neri Pozza. Grazie e alla prossima occasione.
Thank you, Paolo. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.